Greetings and welcome to the third edition of Responsible Public Debate. My name is Ben Schultz, and I started this one with the help of the Ethical Society and several of my friends. I'm glad to actually get to contribute myself to one of the debates. Skeptical astronomer Phil Plait, who runs the Bad Astronomy blog, gave an infamous speech called "Don't Be a Dick" at a well-known skeptical conference in Las Vegas known as TAM. It generated a lot of controversy, continues to be a hot issue in the skeptical movement. And tonight I will continue to defend the basic position Phil laid out, with a few differences and refinements in light of a lot of the feedback that he received. The issue of how to influence culture for the better goes well beyond the skeptical movement. Any position with an important moral and educational message to spread has to wrestle with questions of strategy and tactics. I will be focusing on some of the especially pertinent reasons to be diplomatic when confronting big religion, since that is what I am most familiar with. My qualifications. I'm fairly infamous amongst people who know me for being that crazy diplomat that not only goes the extra mile, but is willing to go 5 extra miles. I have been a rather proficient skeptical blogger since 2005, and have been engaged in worldview battles since 1997. So for the last 13 years, my math is right, I've been attentive from numerous perspectives on how the politics of some prominent culture wars go. In just the last 2 to 3 years, I've started taking diplomacy seriously as the best communication tool, as well as the only way to survive, potentially for decades, in hostile ideological environments, while maintaining the intellectual integrity of my arguments and the effectiveness of my communication. My main argument. Diplomacy is the best tool for the job for most people at most times in most contexts, and is grossly underused by probably just about everyone in every movement in human history. Everyone knows this, as we've seen endless unproductive, hostile, and defensive conversations that go nowhere, and the preliminary indications from the science of the psychology of persuasion seem to bear this out. The minimal times that verbal aggression is justified hardly justify how often and habitually it is often used. If we want a better world, we need to communicate better. Diplomacy is the right tool for that job. Reality enthusiasts can and should set the standard for our overly tribalistic prone species going forward. My message for you tonight: diplomacy is for you. Use it. Overuse it. Use it until it hurts. It's good for you. It's good for your opponents. It's good for the debate. And it's good for the culture at large. Passionate failures of diplomacy may pick off those who are already closely aligned with your values, but most often embitter and entrench the vast majority of everyone else. The overuse of anger has the tendency to make you act and say irrational things. It isn't venting or getting it out. That's a myth. You are feeding and perpetuating a lifestyle, keeping it in tow. Too often, angry ideologues are justifying a habit and making after-the-fact excuses rather than seriously evaluating what works best in most cases or paying attention to the cost of their habitual methodology. And I do my best to employ and advocate the diplomat-only approach. I do my best to tolerate other approaches. In other words, in a similar way that Jesus advocated celibacy in the Bible in Matthew 19, if you can be a celibate, you should, but we'll tolerate boinking, as long as you're married and not gay. That's a paraphrase. I'm not going to be surprised if I find as many atheists and skeptics failing to take up vows of diplomacy as we find modern churches full of celibates. And I think Obama said it best. To all those who think that there's no place for empathy, I say this: I completely understand how you're feeling. The real challenge in this debate between diplomats and firebrands is to get beyond mere anecdotes, either way, since everyone has them, and to establish probability one way or the other. And it doesn't take much to get into the science here. Even a casual read through an introductory wiki page and section on the cognitive effects of anger, and also checking out its references, as you showed, and there are many, and it seems pretty clear this is not the business skeptics should be engaged in. It's a wiki on the cognitive effects of anger. If you are trying to persuade someone that a tax increase is necessary, if the person is currently feeling angry, you would be better to use an argument that elicits anger. More criminals will escape justice than, say, an argument that elicits sadness. There would be fewer welfare benefits for disabled children. So to take this advice, for you angry atheists out there, Wiki also says, unlike other negative emotions like sadness and fear, angry people are more likely to demonstrate correspondence bias, the tendency to blame a person's behavior on his nature than on his circumstances. They tend to rely more on stereotypes and pay less attention to details and more attention to the superficial. In this regard, anger is unlike other negative emotions such as sadness and fear, which actually promote analytical thinking. And a blogger, Tribal Scientist, summarizes still other findings. A 1992 communication study by a leading researcher in the field of aggression and communication Dominic Infante, and I may be pronouncing that wrong, looked into situations where argumentiveness and verbal aggression occurred together and found that the more aggressive the speaker, the less credible they were deemed to be and less able to appear to present a valid argument. Another study investigating argument progression with impaired speakers found verbal aggression was inversely associated with the proportion of arguments. Far from being conducive to discussions on controversial issues, aggressive language reduces desire for verbal interaction and impedes the depth of what is being discussed. And I have all of his references here. So I don't know about you, but using anger to promote skepticism, given that it tends to sabotage critical thinking, ironically makes me pretty angry. And that anger needs to be channeled into something constructive, like diplomacy. Tribal scientists also summarize the findings of when ridicule actually works. In the context of discouraging individual thoughts, encouraging groupthink, conformity, ridicule is extremely effective. The threat of humiliation within a group makes it difficult for black sheep thinking to persist, thereby maintaining an illusion of being an effective way of promoting a particular set of values. And I think part of the problem is overgeneralizing this to work on some meta-cultural level where we are not the tribal leaders. The United States is a fragmented communication failure, a melting pot of all sorts of values. Americans are barely a collectivistic in-group unless someone flies planes into our buildings. Ridicule is fuel for a horrible political atmosphere, and if anyone is going to make it work for them, the majority is probably going to do better with that strategy than we can, even if they are sabotaging themselves in other ways in the long run. Phil Plait pointed out that a minority cannot hope to marginalize the majority, and that anger needs to be used sparingly and discerningly. And another atheist blogger, atheist ethicist, laid out some good criteria for the few times it is actually right to use moral condemnation. I can get into that later in the Q&A. I recommend Tribal Science's entire essay and his references. They're very good. And the wiki on cognitive effects of anger and all those references, and also the book Mistakes Were Made But Not By Me for further study. So science and experience should seal the deal. Phil Plait was criticized for not being specific enough, but I'd be happy to make plenty of specific accusations about the failures of diplomacy on the anti-religion culture front if someone requests it in the Q&A. I have extensive documentation on my blog as well of diplomatic failures and under the tag diplomacy, and I can point people in that direction as well. In addition, I prepared some basic advice on how to do it right if anyone asks me about that. To close, I think it's important to keep this conversation relatively alive. Disagreements may remain, but I think everyone can stand to do continual introspection on their values and priorities and what they're actually hoping to accomplish, if anything, in the culture war of ideas. I hope the arguments and information I presented tonight help to hone everyone's communication skills as a lifelong challenge. And I look forward to engaging whatever JT has to say from his perspective. Thank you.